This is a picture of Eleanor Rosalind Carter, wife of the 29th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, taken on May 6th of 1978. In the picture, we can see her shaking the hand of the director of Chicago's annual Polish Constitution Day Parade, the largest Polish parade outside of the mother country, which celebrates the anniversary of the ratification of the Polish Constitution on May 3rd of 1791. Although not entirely visible in the photograph, the man is wearing a small button on his lapel with nothing but the letter S on it. This indicates his high level of security clearance and was only given to him by Secret Service agents after an intense and probing series of questions, the answers of which would determine if he was of sound enough mind to be close to the First Lady. Rosalind even took the time to sign the photograph, writing a brief note of appreciation to the man in question. "Best wishes," it read, "from Rosalind." Yet on seeing who the note is addressed to, we're forced to do a double take. It opens with, "To John Gacy," a name that should sound horrifyingly familiar to all true crime enthusiasts out there. But to those of you asking, there's no way the Secret Service gave tip-top security clearance to an active serial killer, did they? I'm afraid the answer is a resounding yes. By the time the photograph with the First Lady was taken, it's believed that John Wayne Gacy had already taken the lives of 20 innocent young men. By the end of his murderous career, his body count would reach at least 33, which around 26 of the victims were buried in the crawl space of his home. His usual method was to lure a lone victim to his house on the promise of paid work, plentiful alcohol, or an intimate rendezvous. His victims not only included people he knew personally, but also random individuals lured from bus stations or simply off the streets. Some victims were physically forced into his car, while others were tricked into believing Gacy was a policeman, since he often carried a fake sheriff's badge and would sometimes place a blue flashing light on the roof of his Oldsmobile. Sometimes he'd even lure 2 young victims to his house in the same night, an event which he playfully referred to as doubles. Once inside Gacy's Chicago home, the victim was usually plied with drink and drugs. But if they insisted on sobriety, Gacy would go to work earning their trust in different ways. As we know, Gacy was fond of assuming the persona of Pogo the Clown at various fundraising events for children's charities. But he was also fond of learning and performing magic tricks, one of which was a Houdini-esque display of freeing himself from a pair of handcuffs. Gacy would usually cuff his own hands behind his back, but not before hiding a small handcuff key between his fingers. Then, he would make a show of releasing himself from the cuffs, claiming he had done so without the use of a handcuff key. Naturally, his guests were as impressed as they were astonished, and when Gacy offered to teach them how the trick is done, they jumped at the chance. Then, once his victims were restrained, Gacy would tell them, "The trick is, you need to have the key." We can only imagine the horror they felt once they realized what was happening, that Gacy had fooled them into putting on their own restraints, and how the man himself must have laughed when he saw that terror sparking in their eyes. Once his victims were unable to defend themselves, the horror would begin in earnest. Gacy would often torture his captives by sitting on their chests, allowing his overweight form to crush the breath from them, but never allowing them to fully pass out. He would sometimes force them to act like horses while he rode around on their backs, throttling them with a pair of makeshift reins before he'd burn them with cigars or violate them with household objects. To further immobilize his captives, Gacy was known to create ad hoc ankle manacles out of 2x4s and handcuffs, and was fond of taunting and verbally abusing his prisoners as they tried and failed to escape the restraints. If they became too rowdy or seemed likely to escape, he would sometimes drag them to his bathroom, where he would repeatedly drown and revive his prisoners in order to pacify them and thus prolong the abuse. But once Gacy was tired of toying with his victims, he would typically place a rope tourniquet around their neck before slowly tightening it until they expired. On at least one occasion, he confessed to reciting Psalm 23 as his victim's life slipped away. This is the psalm in which one place reads, "Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil." A sick joke considering his victims had plenty of fear as their life slowly slipped away. Gacy said these victims often convulsed for an hour or so as they died, as generally speaking all expired between the hours of 3 and 6 o'clock in the morning. After that, Gacy would store his victims under his bed for a day or two, toying with their bodies before he buried them on a bed of quicklime in his crawl space. But how did such a monster end up in a photo opportunity with the First Lady? Well, upon Gacy's return to Chicago, he entered party politics on the Democratic side of the spectrum, offering to have the staff of his construction company clean the party's headquarters for free. This public service was rewarded, and he was appointed to serve on the Norwood Park Township Street Lighting Committee, earning the title of Precinct Captain in the process. This eventually led him being appointed as the director of Chicago's annual Polish Constitution Day Parade, which, in turn, opened the door to meet Mrs. Carter. Gacy was eventually arrested and confessed to his crimes in December of 1978. A judge placed him on death row, and he was finally executed by lethal injection on May 9th of 1994. It was the end to the story of a real-life monster, one who delighted in the terror of his victims, and one whose legacy would have an incredible effect on the world around him. This is the last picture ever taken of David Alexander Johnston. After graduating high school in Oak Lawn, Illinois, David planned to study journalism at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, but after finding himself intrigued by an introductory earth sciences class, he swiftly changed his major to that of his newfound passion, geology. Then after David spent a summer in Colorado working with geologist Pete Lippman, he discovered that nothing quite sparked his passion like one of nature's most volatile and deadly phenomena, volcanoes. David joined the United States Geological Survey in 1978, working out of Menlo Park, California, but his work on volcanoes took him all over the Pacific Northwest region. So, when the first earthquakes rumbled through Mount St. Helens on March 16th of 1980, David rushed up to Washington State and soon became the leader of the USGS team monitoring volcanic gas emissions. Mount St. Helens itself has been mostly dormant since its last eruption in 1857, but after 123 years, that was all set to change. For almost a week, more than 100 minor earthquakes provided ample evidence that magma was bubbling up through the earth, but scientists were still in hot debate over whether or not this legitimately signaled an eruption. The small-scale activity continued for almost 2 months, and all the while, the USGS survey team observed the minor eruptions from their 2 observation posts, Coldwater 1 and Coldwater 2, the latter being just 6 miles north of the volcano's peak. Then, on the morning of May 18th, an earthquake measuring magnitude 5.1 rocked the area, triggering the landslide that started the main eruption. Most of the team were at Coldwater 1, safely out of range of the volcano's eruption, but one man had remained at Coldwater 2 to measure gas emissions: David Alexander Johnston. With the overlying rock having been totally blown away, Mount St. Helens began to rapidly emit steam and other volcanic gases. A few seconds later, it erupted laterally, sending swift pyroclastic flows, some as hot as 1,830 degrees Fahrenheit, streaming down its flanks at near supersonic speeds. Before being struck by a series of flows that would have taken less than a minute to reach his position, Johnston managed to radio his USGS coworkers with the code word for its eruption. "Vancouver. Vancouver," he screamed. "This is it." Just seconds later, the signal from the radio went silent, and all contact with the geologist was lost. His colleagues feared the worst, and these fears were confirmed when an amateur radio operator reported his sighting of the eruption engulfing the Coldwater 2 observation post. As the blast ate up David's position, this same amateur radio operator was heard to have screamed out in terror, "It's gonna get me," before his radio went silent too. The eruption of Mount St. Helens was the deadliest and most destructive volcanic eruption in the history of the United States of America. To give you an idea of how destructive it truly was, this is a picture of Mount St. Helens before the eruption, taken on a cloudless spring morning with arterial trails running through the lush green pines. But this is Mount St. Helens after the eruption. It's a photograph taken from almost the exact same position as the first, but it's hard to believe it's even the same scene. Every single living thing has been burned away, leaving nothing but one giant mud plain pockmarked by craters. A total of 57 people lost their lives during the eruption, and thousands more were left homeless when the ash falls and pyroclastic flows destroyed or buried hundreds of nearby houses. In addition to the human fatalities, thousands of animals also perished to the white-hot clouds of ash and volcanic gases. The official statement from the USGS was that around 7,000 game animals and 40,000 salmon, and even then, these are said to be conservative estimates. Despite not being able to recover David's body, hundreds of his colleagues attended his funeral, and he went on to be commemorated in several ways. 2 volcano observatories were established and named after him, one being on the very same ridge where he lost his life, so tragically and suddenly. This is the Robinson family. In 1964, John Edward Robinson moved to Kansas City from his home in Cicero, Illinois, marrying a woman named Nancy Jo Lynch shortly afterward. Nancy gave birth to their first child, John Jr., in 1965, then a daughter, Kimberly, in 1967, followed by twins Christopher and Christine in 1971. One might be forgiven for assuming the wide-eyed baby girl on the patriarch's lap is a new addition to the family, and in a manner of speaking, you'd be correct. You see, the girl's name is Tiffany, and she is about to be adopted by Robinson's brother, as he and his sister-in-law have been having trouble conceiving for quite some time. But as Tiffany grew up, she discovered something horrifying about her adopted family. Not only were they not her biological parents, but they hadn't been entirely truthful with her regarding exactly how she came to be adopted. Because back in 1985, John had met 4-month-old daughter Tiffany and her mother, Lisa Stasi, at a woman's shelter in Kansas City. Just what business he had there is unknown, but the fact of the matter is that upon meeting her, John offered Lisa a job in Chicago, working for his company, Equiplus. Lisa was unsure about uprooting her whole life to move to Chicago, but John was very persuasive, offering her an apartment, daycare for her child, and several other benefits. All she had to do was sign a few pieces of blank stationery so he could transfer her signature to the relevant legal documentation back in the Windy City. It was an offer that a young single mother simply couldn't refuse, and so she put pen to paper and thanked John for the opportunity. But just a few days later, John Robinson contacted her brother and sister-in-law, delighting them with the good news that he'd found a baby for them, one whose mother had taken her own life. All they had to do was send him just over $5,000 in legal fees, then Don and Helen Robinson would be the proud parents of a baby named Tiffany, whose mother had signed the adoption papers with the name Lisa Stasi. Stasi was never heard from again. Even when a police task force searched the storage facility where Robinson rented 2 garages, they only found 3 chemical drums containing the corpses of 3 other victims that they'd tricked into trusting him before brutally murdering them. Lisa's remains are still undiscovered even today. In 2002, after the longest criminal trial in Kansas history, John Edward Robinson was convicted on all counts and was handed the death sentence as punishment for his crimes. He now resides on death row at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in the state of Kansas, but law enforcement fear that his story might not yet be over. He maintained the secrets about what he'd done with the women he won't ever tell. It's the last control that he's got, said one particular homicide detective. There are probably other barrels out there waiting to be opened, other bodies waiting to be found. This is a picture of 17-year-old Tyler Hadley. It's a selfie that was taken by his best friend, Michael Mandel, during a house party Tyler threw at his parents' home on July 16, 2011. As you can see, Michael has a rather stern look on his face, while Hadley looked almost depressed for someone in the middle of a wild beer pong party. There's an unmistakable sadness in his eyes, a look that verges on raw anguish. Yet as we learn what had happened just a few hours before the photo was taken, we start to understand why he might have such a look about him, and why Michael Mandel took the photo, believing it was the last time he'd ever see his best friend again. Growing up in Port St. Lucie, Florida, Tyler's teenage years hit him harder than most. Port St. Lucie is definitely not a place that any teenager might consider fun. Named after the patron saint of people with eye problems, the town was founded by a trio of problems from Jacksonville, determined to profit from the massive migration of retirees to South Florida. As a result, there's very little for a young person to do to keep themselves entertained. Therefore, it's of little surprise that juvenile criminality is slightly higher than most. For all intents and purposes, the boredom of Port St. Lucie can literally drive to drug use just to keep from going crazy, and they do, in their hundreds. Tyler began suffering from mental health issues by the time he was 14, and by 15, he'd attended multiple psychiatrist appointments, but nothing seemed to help. Instead, like many of his peers, he sought relief in marijuana, which was bountiful in the Port St. Lucie area at the time of his adolescence. But smoking only seemed to exacerbate his condition. By 17, his parents had enrolled him in an outpatient mental health and substance abuse program. But again, there seemed to be no observable improvements in his condition. There came a time when Tyler's rebellious behavior crossed a line and became overtly self-destructive. To combat this, his parents set harsher and harsher conditions on his lifestyle, often forbidding him from seeing his close friends for weeks at a time. But still he managed to sneak out, still he managed to use drugs, and still his mental condition worsened. It was a vicious cycle. As his behavior grew worse, the punishments got harsher, and as the punishments got harsher, so his behavior grew worse. Tyler's friends knew all about this, so when he claimed that his parents were going out of town and that he had been permitted to throw a house party, his friends were deeply skeptical. On the day in question, one of them texted him to ask if the party was still on. "Working on it," Tyler replied. But his friend couldn't have any idea what working on it entailed. Because on the day of the party, just before 5 p.m., Tyler went about surreptitiously collecting his parents' cell phones. Once that task was completed, he walked up to his bedroom with a glass of water and swallowed 3 ecstasy tablets before collecting a claw hammer from his father's toolkit. After that, Tyler walked up behind his mother, who was sitting at the family computer, and brought the flat side of the hammer smashing down on top of her skull. Tyler later said that all she screamed before she fell silent was "why?" Her scream alerted Tyler's father, who ran into the room to find his own son, his own flesh and blood, standing over the lifeless body of his mother, whose skull was now little more than a fractured, bloody mess. Tyler and his father stared at each other for a moment, each one hesitating, unable to believe what was happening. But when Blake made a break for it, Tyler chased his father down and smashed his head in much the same way that he had his mother's. As he beat his father to death, he began too to ask, "Why, Tyler? Why?" "Why not?" Tyler said he replied, before bringing the hammer down onto his father's face one final time. Tyler spent the next 3 hours cleaning up his parents' blood, mopping up their brains, and vacuuming up pieces of skull fragment from the carpet. And once he'd hidden their bodies in the home's master bedroom, he texted his friends, letting them know that the party was on. Around 1 in the morning, after a night of pretty wild partying, Tyler asked his friend Michael Mandel if they could have a word in private. They'd been best friends since the 3rd grade, long enough for Michael to know that something was seriously off with Tyler. While the 60 or so other kids had been tearing around the house, causing mischief and getting high, Tyler had been unusually subdued considering the occasion. But when Michael asked him what the matter was, Tyler's reply stunned him. "I killed my parents," he said. Michael laughed it off at first. Tyler had a dark sense of humor and had joked about taking his parents' lives on several occasions, but as he continued to stare into his friend's face, he realized it was no joke. Michael then looked back at the Hadley's driveway and saw the Hadley's cars still parked up and idle. All the signs were there. Tyler said it himself, but Michael still refused to believe it. So Tyler led Michael up to the master bedroom of the house, showing him traces of blood on the door. Michael then unlocked the door and looked inside. Inside, he saw a huge pile of blood-soaked towels, and sticking out from under them was a single, pale leg. After finally processing the information at hand and accepting that his best friend had in fact killed his own parents, Michael Mandel was faced with a grim prospect: never seeing Tyler ever again. So in that moment, Michael did the only thing that made sense to him. He took out his phone, turned on the forward-facing camera, and took a photograph to remember the moment by. Knowing the thoughts that must have been going through Tyler's head gives the photograph a whole new sense of scope and scale. We really are looking at a vision of pure anguish, the face of a boy who'd taken away the lives of those who loved him the most, and who planned to take his own life later that night. Luckily for Tyler, Michael Mandel proved to be a truly brilliant friend, and after his confession, Michael not only went about hiding or disposing of anything Tyler might use to take his own life, but he also called Crime Stoppers, informing them of absolutely everything Tyler had told him. It might seem cynical, but it was what Tyler needed, and although for a long, long time Tyler held resentment for Michael, he inevitably came to the conclusion that his friend just wanted the best for him, even if he'd done something truly terrible. In 2014, Tyler was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole and currently resides at the Okeechobee Correctional Institution in South Central Florida. Tyler has released several letters from prison, some of which provide a deeper insight into his thought process, as well as raising deep philosophical questions on the nature of crime, punishment, and forgiveness. One reads, "I ruined a lot of people's lives and I can't seem to forgive myself. I find myself crying a lot because of all the guilt. Every day I beg for forgiveness and I ask God not to send me to hell. I don't want to go there. I'm not a cold-blooded monster like everyone thinks I am. I'm a caring person that made a horrible mistake. And I'm so sorry for everything I've done." Take a look at this rather grainy picture. You'll have to forgive the quality as it was taken more than 100 years ago. But as you can see, it clearly shows a makeshift wire fence that's been hammered into what appears to be a grassy field. Yet in the center of the wire fence is a very distinct shape, that of a human being. But how was it that such a clear indentation came to be visible in the grass, and where was the photograph taken? Well, that story begins more than a century ago on the night of October 1st, 1916. The German Empire had been at war with the United Kingdom for more than 2 years by the time Kapitanleutnant Heinrich Mathy and his crew took to the skies in their LZ-72 combat Zeppelin. But Mathy was no ordinary Zeppelin commander. He was a household name in the UK. He had been a leading commander in the so-called Zeppelin Scourge of 1915 and 1916, and was greatly feared as the most daring and audacious of all the Zeppelin raiders. He had taken part in a huge raid on the British port of Sunderland just a few months before, one that had caused considerable damage to the area's maritime industry. But in October, he had a new and bigger target, one that would bring him considerable prestige and regard from Kriegsmarine Command: London. The trouble with airships is that despite being so incredibly huge, they were incredibly difficult to detect during the much preferred night raids. Zeppelins traveled so silently that Britain anti-aircraft crews had to be extra vigilant in order to even spot one. But usually, the only way of knowing there was even an airship above you was hearing the whistles of bombs as they hurtled to Earth. So, for an uncomfortably long time, the British found it simply impossible to shoot down a German Zeppelin, and the crews of these wondrous new machines reveled in that fact. Yet it was during a raid on London in August of 1916 that the British came up with an ingenious solution. They used incendiary rounds in their anti-aircraft guns, and when the airstrikes came, they lit up the night sky with fire and flame. After that, the Germans didn't feel so invincible anymore. Mathy was haunted by the things he saw that night, and in his diary he wrote, "It is only a question of time before we join the rest. Everyone admits that they feel it. Our nerves are ruined by mistreatment. If anyone should say that he was not plagued by visions of burning airships, then he would be a braggart." The raid planned for London on the night of October 1st was supposed to be something like revenge for Mathy and his crew. They had lost many of their comrades during the August raid, and they hoped to even the score that night. Yet as it turned out, the only people to die that night was Mathy and his men, as a plucky young British second lieutenant named W.J. Tempest managed to spot them just 4 miles north of their target. He instantly sounded the alarm, and thanks to his vigilance, every single anti-aircraft battery in the vicinity was able to send a barrage of flammable explosive material flying at the Zeppelin. The ship burned for a time, then began its slow descent towards the earth just outside of a place called Potter's Barn. Kapitanleutnant Mathy, knowing he'd be burned alive if he held onto the burning wreckage while it crashed, jumped from the Zeppelin from an unknown but undeniably great height, and when his body was found and removed from the scene, the picture you saw is of the indentation that remained. Mathy now lies in Cannock Chase in Staffordshire, in a cemetery housing all Germans from both world wars who died on British soil. He lies buried there with his crew, near the entrance, along with the commanders and crews of the other 3 airships which were shot down over England. May he and all of his fellow soldiers, on all sides of that brutal, pointless conflict, find the peace that so eluded them in life. This is 14-year-old Regina K. Walters, and the photograph itself was taken by a man named Robert Ben Rhodes. Tragically, this photograph would be the last one ever taken of her, as Rhodes was just minutes away from attacking and strangling her to death. Because you see, Rhodes is perhaps better known by another kind of name entirely: the truck stop killer. It's thought that not only did Rhodes murder at least 3 women, but he's also suspected of torturing, violating, and killing more than 50 women between the years of 1975 and 1990. After a brief stint in the Marine Corps and 2 unsuccessful marriages, Robert found himself with a growing interest in the BDSM lifestyle. Only, Unlike many of his kinkier peers, Robert did draw the line at consensual intimacy. He got off on cruelty. His third wife, Deborah, alleged that he both verbally and physically abused her during their time together, often in the context of bondage, domination, and sadomasochism. She added that Robert had a particular set of leather bondage clothes that he liked to wear, and that after a while of dabbling in the community, he decided to convert the sleeper cab of his long-haul truck into his own personal torture chamber, complete with restraints, whips, and gags. But as we've already stated, this conversion wasn't designed for innocent consensual fun. Rhodes wanted prisoners, he wanted slaves, and when he was bored with them, they were swiftly disposed of. And tragically, that's exactly what happened to 14-year-old Regina Walters. Just a few days before she was captured by Rhodes, Regina and her boyfriend, Ricky Lee, had both run away from their homes in the Houston suburb of Pasadena. After offering to give them a ride, it's thought that Rhodes quickly dispatched Ricky Lee with a gunshot to the head before he took Regina prisoner. But the truly horrifying thing is the length of time she was kept prisoner. Photographs that were later recovered from Rhodes' truck showed that Regina's hair was at several different lengths in different collections of photos, meaning she'd have been kept prisoner so long that Rhodes was forced to actually groom her appearance. Then, on the day she was killed, Rhodes cut Regina's hair, gave her a new dress and high heels to wear, and told her he had a very special surprise for her. He drove her out to a barn in rural Illinois and told her to look scared while he took photographs of her. It's entirely possible that Regina believed she wouldn't be harmed if she cooperated. Rhodes had kept her alive for months by that point. She obviously had value to him, so she must have doubted the ease with which he'd eventually dispose of her. And dispose of her he did. But Regina would prove to be the truck stop killer's final victim. In the early morning of April 1st, 1990, Trooper Mike Miller of the Arizona Highway Patrol found a truck at the side of I-10 with its hazard lights on. When he investigated inside the cab, he discovered a naked woman, handcuffed and screaming. When the driver suddenly appeared, the officer demanded the man identify himself. The driver complied, and his name was Robert Ben Rhodes. After failing to talk his way out of the situation, Rhodes was arrested, and in 1994, Rhodes was convicted of the first-degree murder of Regina K. Walters, with a judge sentencing him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. There will come a day when Rhodes will pass on, and for the most part, his deeds will thankfully be forgotten. But thanks to modern photographical technology, a little piece of evil, and the harrowing results of it, is forever preserved for the curious to gaze upon. How's about this picture? At first glance, it's something that many of us can relate to. A young woman warming up her poor little pupper whilst out walking on a cold winter's day. Yet there's something grimly significant about the place the woman is kneeling, and on further examination, we start to notice the signs of disturbed earth. Then there's the large stones that seem to have been deliberately placed there, as if to mark something. Truth be told, they are there to mark something, because those stones mark the grave of 12-year-old John Kilbride. And the woman who kneels over his final resting place had a hand in his murder. You see, the woman's name is Myra Hindley, one half of the infamously evil Moors murderers. In January of 1961, an 18-year-old Hindley got a job as a typist at a chemical distribution company in Manchester, England. It was there that she met a 23-year-old man from Glasgow, Scotland, named Ian Brady. Hindley soon learned that Brady had a criminal record and that one of the charges stemmed from an incident in which another boy had flirted with Brady's girlfriend. Brady had responded by threatening the boy with a flick knife and was arrested shortly afterward. The fact that Hindley found this to be attractive speaks volumes of her character, and because she kept a detailed diary of that period of her life, we know a great deal of how she felt and how the two came together. Hindley and Brady first spoke on July 27th of 1961, and from that day forward, she grew increasingly infatuated with him. She continued to make diary entries about him over the next 6 months or so, detailing their flirtations at work and her desires to take their playfulness further. But for one reason or another, Brady never asked her out. It appears that the budding romance between the couple seemed to fizzle out around the fall of that same year, as there are multiple entries in Hindley's diary which detailed her growing disillusionment with him. But then, on December 22nd, Brady finally asked her on a date. For their first date, the couple decided to go see a movie. According to Hindley's diary, it was something innocent with a few musical numbers, but afterward, Brady asked her if she wanted to watch a very different kind of movie. It was then that he took her to an X-rated movie theater in a much seedier district on the opposite side of Manchester, and with the tone set, it was back to Hindley's flat to reenact some of the things they'd seen on screen. After a few weeks of dating, Brady started to recommend books to Hindley, namely works by Marquis de Sade and Friedrich Nietzsche. But after a while, Brady began to provide her with much more sinister material, namely his collection of books detailing German atrocities during the Second World War. But it was not with grim fascination that the couple read about the horrors of National Socialism. It was with a bloodthirsty approval. Hindley began to cultivate a facade of racial perfection, bleaching her hair blonde and applying thick crimson lipstick in an attempt to win Brady's approval. She also began wearing clothing considered risque for the period, things like knee-high boots, short skirts, and leather jackets. In one letter to a friend, Hindley spoke of her utter obsession with Brady, but also mentioned how he'd once drugged her, tied her up, and beaten her horribly. Yet still she professed her love for him. She would later remark that, within months he had convinced me that there was no God at all. He could have told me that the earth was flat, the moon was made of green cheese, and the sun rose in the west. I would have believed him. Such was his power of persuasion. By July of 1963, the couple had begun to discuss what they called their perfect murder. This was apparently inspired by the 1956 Meyer Levin novel titled Compulsion, in which two young men from rich families planned to execute the perfect murder, ultimately escaping justice as a result of their malevolent diligence. They began to fantasize about being able to kill indiscriminately and without consequence, just like so many of the Germans they'd read about had done, and soon, what had once been a fantasy became a raw, unceasing compulsion. On July 12th of 1963, the couple murdered their first victim. Pauline Reed had attended the same school as Hindley's younger sister Maureen, and had also been in a brief relationship with David Smith, a local boy who was often in trouble with the law. Police found no one who had seen Reed before her disappearance, and although the 15-year-old David was questioned in connection with Pauline's disappearance, he was ultimately cleared of any involvement in her murder. Their couple's next victim, 12-year-old John Kilbride, was killed on November 23rd of that same year. Following his sudden disappearance, a huge search effort was mounted with almost 1,000 witness statements taken by police and just over 500 missing posters printed and distributed around Greater Manchester. On top of that, an appeal for volunteers to aid in the search saw over 2,000 people from all over the UK descend on Manchester to search waste ground and derelict buildings. But unfortunately, not a single trace of John Kilbride was found. Then on December 21st, Hindley drove the couple out to the burial site in a hired car, as not to raise suspicion. The purpose of the trip was to ensure the earth hadn't been disturbed. It hadn't, but Brady took the opportunity to take a photograph of Hindley kneeling at the grave with her dog, Puppet, tucked into her jacket. The fact that such a moment was considered worthy of being preserved for posterity is frankly appalling, and only speaks to the evil of Brady and Hindley, that they considered killing children to be something of a grand adventure, something they wanted to look back on in years to come. During the couple's eventual trial, the piece of evidence was produced that continues to horrify all those who hear it even today. It was a 16-minute audio tape, one of which had been used to document the torture and death of 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey. Leslie Ann had been abducted from a fun fair in Manchester's Ancoats district on Boxing Day of 1964. Brady and Hindley tricked her into following them back to their house, where she was subjected to some of the cruelest, most stomach-churning treatment imaginable. She was undressed, gagged, then forced to pose for photographs before being violated and murdered, most probably strangled with a piece of thick electrical cord, and Brady had made sure to record the entire thing, all while playing Christmas music in the background. "Please don't undress me again," she is heard saying at one point. Then in another she says, "I want to see my mummy." But little Leslie Ann would never see Mummy again, and the British public were beyond enraged with those that had made that a reality. On May 6th of 1966, after having deliberated for a little over 2 hours, the jury found Brady guilty of all 3 murders, while Hindley was deemed guilty of just 2. At the time of their arrest, many believed the couple would be executed, as Britain still handed out the death penalty to particularly cruel murders. But in the bizarre twist of fate, the death penalty was abolished on November 8th of 1965, while Brady and Hindley were still in custody. Therefore, when it came to sentencing, the judge passed the harshest possible: life imprisonment, with Brady being given 3 concurrent life sentences and Hindley being given 2. In his closing remarks, the presiding judge described the couple as 2 sadistic killers of the utmost depravity. But it seems that even such a colorful remark as that doesn't quite touch on the harrowing evil of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, the Moors murderers. This is a picture of 28-year-old Zach Bowen and his 28-year-old girlfriend, Addie Hall. Taken on September 13th of 2005, the photograph shows the couple sitting on the front steps of their home in New Orleans, French Quarter, about 2 weeks after the city was battered by Hurricane Katrina. Having met whilst working as bartenders, they dated on and off during the months leading up to Katrina, and were among the handful of residents who refused to evacuate, not because they weren't afraid of the approaching maelstrom, rather because they simply had no place else to go. Together, they rode out the hurricane together in a tiny, cramped apartment, and although the experience was a truly harrowing one, it formed an almost unbreakable bond between them. It also happened to be the case that Zach and Addie were usually adept at surviving in post-Katrina New Orleans. Zach had spent several years in the Army prior to moving to the Crescent City from his native California and was seemingly unbothered by the lack of utilities. After all, having taken part in the 2003 invasion of Iraq, Zach was used to much worse conditions and considerably more danger. Addie had been a bartender and occasional stripper before the storm hit, but despite her small stature, she was more than capable of handling herself. In fact, the mousy young lady was in her element when marshalling bars full of crowdy Norland drunks, some of which were nearly twice her size. Together, they didn't just excel at handling their new, near-post-apocalyptic lifestyle, they actually made the lives of their neighbors more bearable too. Zach and Addie were known to encourage impromptu block parties, playing music in the early evenings while handing out cocktails to their neighbors. And while under normal circumstances that might be seen as perhaps a little irritating, their efforts were exactly what a heartbroken and traumatized community needed: a drink, a dance, a chance to forget their sorrows, if only for a little while. The New Orleans way. Over the weeks that followed, various media outlets sent reporters down to New Orleans to photograph and interview the couple. America was fascinated with these 2 young lovers who turned suburban survivalists, who, despite having lost almost everything, were still carefree, in love, and above all, happy. But sadly, this happiness was not to last, and in an instance of deep and tragic irony, as New Orleans slowly got back on its feet, Zach and Addie's relationship slowly deteriorated. Each was haunted by their pasts, and now that Katrina was over, the cracks began to appear. According to friends, Addie was running from something that she couldn't really talk about, but it's suspected that she had experienced violent abuse at the hands of previous boyfriends. Zach, on the other hand, was haunted by an incident that occurred on his first tour of Iraq. After befriending a young Iraqi boy in the capital, Baghdad, he later discovered the boy was killed as punishment for interacting with Americans. Even worse, their alcoholism had allegedly grown out of control in the weeks that followed Katrina, to the point where neighbors said that Addie had become a nasty, violent drunk who took her spite out on Zach whenever she'd had a little too much to drink. Friends mentioned that Addie became particularly irate after suspecting Zach of cheating, and that she tried to throw him out of their apartment above New Orleans' Voodoo Spiritual Temple on North Rampart Street. But the death blow for the relationship seemed to come when the couple started using cocaine. Allegedly, a friend of theirs, nicknamed Squirrel, was supplying them with large amounts of cocaine, and it's unclear where the couple was getting the money to pay for it, or if they were in fact incurring huge debts from their use of the drug. But the fact remains, without an existential crisis to sustain them, their relationship was in free fall, and it wasn't long before it crashed to earth completely. On the night of October 17, 2006, a New Orleans police dispatcher received a call from the Omni Royal Orleans Hotel. It was a member of staff claiming they just witnessed a man jumping off the hotel's rooftop bar. The man had fallen 7 stories and was instantly killed when he landed on top of a nearby parking garage. The police arrived to find the body was totally unrecognizable, but in the corpse's front shirt pocket was a small plastic bag containing a pair of army dog tags and a key to an apartment building. The name on the dog tags was Zach Bowen. Police contacted Zach's landlord to obtain a search warrant for his apartment. When they entered, they saw a message spray-painted on the kitchen wall. It read simply, "Look in the oven." But when they did, there was nothing that could have prepared them for what they saw and smelled. Inside the oven were pieces of Addie Hall's dismembered corpse. Zach Bowen had tried to roast her. According to forensic examiners, Zach had caught Addie while she was in the bathtub, strangling her with a piece of cord before he commenced to dismember her lifeless body. He then set 2 pots of water to boil on their apartment's kitchen stove, then placed her head into one and her feet into the other. The idea was to tenderize the flesh, making it easier to strip from the bone. Other pieces of her body were crammed into the kitchen's oven, which Zach hoped he could use to cremate her. But their small commercial oven was in no way designed to reach the temperatures needed for proper incineration, and although what remained was rendered unrecognizable, it was impossible to burn away the pieces entirely. It should be made abundantly clear that there was absolutely no evidence that Zach had intended or attempted to consume any of Addie's flesh, and despite the grisly connotations of roasting and boiling her body parts, this is definitely not a case that includes any form of cannibalism. Perhaps one of the only things we don't know about Zach is what exactly caused him to murder his girlfriend. There's a good chance that her increasingly violent behavior, coupled with his cocaine-induced paranoia, left the former soldier in fear for his life. It might have been the case that, as horrible as it may seem, Zach took a "it's her or me" attitude towards the relationship and decided to take her life. I'm not saying that's excusable. I'm simply grasping for explanations as to why a man might kill a woman he purported to be in love with. And maybe that's just it. Maybe he knew he couldn't live with her, but he also couldn't live without her. Who knows what went through the mind of a traumatized young man before he so violently snapped, taking the life of the person closest to him, all before cooking her remains. This is the Iroquois Theatre in the city of Chicago. When the theater opened in 1903, those that constructed the place claimed it was totally and utterly fireproof, as it included a new state-of-the-art curtain material which was said to be flame inhibitory. The theater was lauded by drama critics, with some saying that the Iroquois was the most beautiful in Chicago, and competent judges state that few theaters in America can rival its architectural perfections. But just like the unsinkable Titanic which followed her, fate turned the builder's claims into a sick joke when the theater caught fire on Wednesday, December 30th of that very same year it was opened. And if you look very carefully at the photograph in question, near the glass windows in the top left-hand side of the picture, you'll see a little whiff of smoke from the very same fire that killed hundreds in just a few short minutes. That night, around 600 people attended the performance of a play called Bluebeard, a French folktale which tells the story of a wealthy man in the habit of murdering his wives and the attempts of one wife to avoid the fate of her predecessors. Yet midway through the performance, it's thought that one of the old arc lights the theater had bought suddenly became faulty. They began to blink and spark, before eventually shorting out completely and causing one of the stage curtains to burst into flames. Visitors must have been horrified to learn that the brand new fireproof theater, in fact, was anything but. But they must have been doubly horrified to discover that because the architects really believed their own nonsense, they had neglected to stock the theater with any kind of fire extinguisher, only a kind of fire-inhibitant powder that proved to be horribly inadequate at snuffing out the flames. But then came the theater's secret weapon, a supposedly fireproof curtain which would protect the audience from the flames. Only, when it was dropped, it snagged halfway down on one of the old arc lights, proving yet another colossal failure. In a sudden panic, one of the theater's employees rushed to open up a back door to the theater in the hopes that this would provide an additional escape route. But this only caused a huge backdraft of air to enter the already burning building, fueling the fire and turning into a fireball that ripped through the seating area, incinerating hundreds of people in mere seconds. Some in the upper seating areas had rushed out of the playroom, only to find they became entrapped in the narrow corridors of the newly built theater. This was due to the fact that some of the non-opening windows into the vestibule resembled doors, an absurd artistic decision, not to mention that some of the real doors used what's known as an espagnolet or bascule lock, an old French lock that most Americans had no idea how to operate at the time of the fire. As a result, people began piling up at these false doors because of the poorer, less educated people at the front had no idea how to open them. It is likely they were crushed to death over nothing more than a deadly misunderstanding. When the fire reached the Iroquois' fuse box, the power to the theater went out and the corridors, where many people were attempting to escape from, was cast into pitch darkness. As the heat intensified, so did the smoke, choking up the corridors where the bodies began literally piling up to the ceiling in the blocked doorways. Some people were fortunate enough to be able to get through one of the doors, although many were still trapped under the pile of bodies and burned alive or asphyxiated. Due to the fancy French decorations, some people were said to have had their clothing or feet trapped in the fancy wrought iron balustrades and gates as they attempted to rush down the corridor stairs. Many tripped and were stampeded over by fleeing attendees. Those in the orchestra section were able to exit into the foyer and out the front door, but those in the dress circle and gallery who escaped the fireball were unable to reach the foyer because the iron gates that barred the stairs were still in place. The largest death toll was at the base of these stairways, where hundreds of people were trampled, crushed, or suffocated to death. This incident is why we have fire escapes and safety push bars today. It still, however, didn't prevent the station nightclub fire a few decades ago from claiming the lives of many, and the footage of that is a brief insight into the terror that the people of the Iroquois Theatre must have experienced. Take a look at this violin. With its accompanying carrying case, this old thing could easily be an old piece of two-string junk, pulled out of some old attic somewhere that sounds like a dying cat when played. However, you may be surprised to learn that in October of 2013, an anonymous buyer paid an eye-watering $1.6 million at English auction house Henry Aldridge and Son. But the truth is, this particular violin is priceless, because it once belonged to a Mr. Wallace Hartley, one of the 1,500 people to perish when the HMS Titanic sank in April of 1912. As the Titanic sank, the story goes that Wallace Hartley and his orchestra stayed on deck and continued playing Nearer My God to Thee. The band and their instruments, according to lore, went down with the 1,500 other people who died that day. But as it turns out, before going into the water, Hartley placed the violin in a leather case which protected it from the elements, and his body and the case were recovered by one of the ships that later arrived on the scene. The violin was given to Hartley's fiancée, Maria Robinson, but upon her death, it passed through the hands of various relatives before being rediscovered in the year 2006. If the story is true, the musical instrument you see before you played the final piece of music that over 1,000 people heard before they died. All their terror, all their regret, all the anguish of knowing they were lost, it was all soundtracked by the song of that worn old violin, weeping away, as it too played its own funeral dirge. Hey friends, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed these pictures with creepy backstories, be sure to check out Volume 1, as well as music with creepy backstories, all linked down below. And click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations as I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links down below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.